In this video, I'd like to talk to you about the Ottoman and colonial presence and history of the Arabian Peninsula, for you to understand the background against which the modern Gulf states have sprang up. So if you look at the map that we've shown a few times by now, representing Ottoman presence in the region, you will see that Ottoman presence on the Arabian Peninsula was limited to it was almost like a crescent around the Arabian Peninsula. It was limited to the coastal areas in the west. Initially, it reached Aden and Yemen in the south, and at some point in the late 19th century, it reached Al-Haza, which is south of today's Kuwait. But the interior of the island, the peninsula, remained largely devoid of Ottoman presence. And that is for two reasons. One is the difficulty of communications in the 18th and 19th century. But perhaps more importantly, the simple lack of interest of the Ottomans or anybody else in that region. It was a very poor region. It was very remote, largely desert, inhabited by nomadic tribes. There was not much for an outside power to do there. And this pattern persists right up to the 20th century. And it's important to remember that the people living in the interior of the Arabian Peninsula basically continue with a pattern of life that is unchanged for a very, very long time. The Ottomans had two primary interests in the region, and they become apparent if you look at the map and the presence that they have in the region. The first is that, as I said before, the interior of the Arabian Peninsula is left to its own devices. So you have nomadic, relatively bellicose tribes, and these tribes organize periodic raids into the settled agricultural provinces of Syria and Iraq. So the Ottomans had one interest in stopping or limiting these raids into their established provinces. The other interest that they have was, if you look at the map, the Ottomans have control over the two holy shrines of Islam, Mecca and Medina. And there is an annual pilgrimage, and ensuring the safety of the pilgrimage has always historically been one of the primary tasks of the caliph. And the Ottoman sultans have assumed this role, and it's a role on which a large degree of their legitimacy depends. So ensuring the safety of the pilgrimage is the second main interest that the Ottomans have in the region. And both of these interests devolve to the Syrian governorate. It's not something that the Supreme Court in Istanbul occupies itself with. So it's a task that is delegated to the Syrian governor. And the lack of communication and the lack of interest therefore limits the interest that the Ottomans and everybody else has in the Arabian Peninsula, which allows them to maintain this relatively isolated way of life. All this now changes in the late 19th century, early 20th century. You see here a picture of the famous Baghdad Bahn, the Baghdad railway that the Germans helped the Ottomans to build, and that initially connects the Ottoman heartland with the Iraqi province, with Baghdad, and then eventually is extended to reach Mecca. And that is obviously now facilitating greatly the annual pilgrimage. And so the security of this railway link is now is a primary concern of the Ottomans. The other thing to remember is that with the added communication patterns, communication possibilities that now exist, the Ottomans are able to extend their reach to Aden in the southwest and to Al-Haza on the east of the Arabian Peninsula. But generally, it's a relatively, as everywhere else, it follows the Ottoman pattern of a relatively remote, nominal suzerainty, leaving local rulers to their own devices. And one of the chief local rulers is the Sharif of Mecca, who is paying allegiance to the Ottoman sultan, but otherwise is more or less autonomous in the relatively small region around the two holy shrines, the Hejaz, the region. And the Sharif Hussein of Mecca now assumes in the late 19th century, early 20th century, a particular prominence. He has ambitions to be the leader of the Arabs as such. Now that the Arab nationalism starts developing, he elaborates a claim to leadership of the Arabs, and we will see how that claim is recognized by both external and local forces. Here you can see a picture of Sharif Hussein, who seeks to become king of the Arabs, which is not going to happen, but you will see what happens to his children. British presence in the 19th century now on the Arabian Peninsula is limited to the coastal areas. It has established coaling stations in Aden to support its communication links from India through the Suez Canal to the British Isles, and has begun to form treaty arrangements with the coastal sheikdoms. In the First World War, however, remember, the region is still part of the Ottoman Empire, and the Ottoman Empire has also limited but important interests there. And it is here that the British Empire sees it to be in their interests to foment internal unrest against Ottoman rule. And you might have seen the film Lawrence of Arabia with Peter O'Toole, which is a fairly famous film from the 1960s, based on the autobiography of Thomas Edward Lawrence, whom you can see on this picture, who was a British colonial officer detached to the Arabs and who tried to help them in the Arab revolt against Ottoman rule. The victorious powers of the First World War have now their own colonial ambitions on the territories that are now becoming available. And there is an agreement between the French and the British foreign ministers. Here you see a picture of Monsieur Sykes and Monsieur Picot, who have carved up the territories that are likely now to become available after the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire. And as you can see on this map here, their respective interests are primarily concerned with the Syrian and Iraqi provinces of the Ottoman Empire. And in the British case, reaching down to the eastern part of the coast of the Arabian Peninsula. But again, just following the pattern of throughout the 19th century, they have no interest in the interior of the Arabian Peninsula. Again, remember, this is prior to the discovery of oil in this region. There's not much for an external power to do or to gain there. We have, in the context of the post-war settlement, now the mandate system that we have talked about, and that we will also return to when we talk about Syria and Iraq. But it's important to note here that the mandate system is not something that is directly applicable to the Arabian Peninsula. We have there local rulers who have who continue in their rulership in their respective local provinces, or as in the Saudi case, who are now re-establishing their authority. And the British Empire, that is the dominant external power there now, has contented itself with concluding protective arrangements with these local rulers, in a sense following a pattern already set by the Ottomans. And they do not become directly involved, and so they do not establish a direct colonial presence, but limit themselves to a protective arrangement that secures their interests. So if you look now at the modern map of the Arabian Peninsula, you see on the south and southeastern coast of the Arabian Peninsula a number of states that have grown up. And in the middle, occupying by far the biggest space, is Saudi Arabia. The thing to remember now is that the states on the coast that have developed have all existed throughout the 19th century. They sprang from local sheikdoms that had, through the 19th century, entered into formal treaty arrangements with the British Empire. In Oman, the British presence is less formalized, but in all of the others, we're talking de facto protectorates. The British have a firm colonial presence there, and they conduct the foreign affairs of these principalities, and they control largely their political destiny. But they do not engage themselves very heavily in the domestic affairs of these societies. Saudi Arabia itself is the product of an alliance between one of the tribes in the Arabian Peninsula, and in particular the Muhammad ibn Saud, the founding father of the dynasty, who started to consolidate his control over his own tribe, but then over the neighboring tribes. And in order to achieve this, he enters into an alliance of sorts with a charismatic preacher at the time, Muhammad ibn Abd al-Wahhab, who is preaching a very puritanical version of the already rather strict Hanbali sect of Islamic doctrine. So this is an alliance that forms in the 1700s, and the consolidation of control in the Arabian Peninsula goes back and forth. There are waves of it in it. So at some point the Ottomans become involved. They sent Muhammad Ali in the 19th century to suppress them. So Muhammad Ali is partly successful, but not completely. So there's a reversal of fortunes. And in the early 20th century, the Saudi movement, let's call it that way, fueled by this religious fervor, and they create the Saudi troops are called the Ikhwan, the brothers. They follow this fervent, religiously fueled expansionism. They managed to subdue most of the other tribes, particularly the rival Al-Rashid family, and consolidate their hold over much of what is today Saudi Arabia. They, like the other coastal principalities, they enter into negotiations with the British and seek a formal protection from them. The British remain relatively aloof because they do not see much to be gained in a formal alliance. But as the 20th century then unfolds, the British do take a very prominent role in supporting and protecting the now growing Saudi state from external threats. So we, in a sense, while the Saudi government is more autonomous than the other coastal principalities, it follows the same pattern of a close protective alliance with the main external power in the region, which is Britain at the time. One thing that is again common for all of the states in the Arabian Peninsula at the time is the very precarious financial situation of these economies. These are very, very traditional societies with a very, very small economic base. There's some pearl fishing on the eastern coast. And the primary source of income for the Saudis, for example, is taxes levied on the pilgrimage. So you can imagine that this is not a very prosperous arrangement. And all of these societies rely to some, or their governments rely to some extent on financial support from the British government. this pattern of reliance on pearl fishing, some trade, and the pilgrimage remains the dominant source of income right up to the 1930s when oil is discovered. And now we see the beginning of a pattern, to which we will come back in one of the later videos, that foreign interests come and in return for a concession, i.e. the permission to explore for oil, they pay the local rulers a certain sum of money. And that certain sum of money might be relatively small in relation to the profits generated from the oil discovery. But in absolute terms, for the local rulers, these are very significant funds. Remember that these are economies that are very, very poor and have very small resource base. So now all of a sudden you get this access to basically free money. There's no local input required. The technology, the operation, everything is coming from the outside forces. And this allows the local rulers to consolidate their authority over their leaders, and allows them to maintain and continue their traditional way of life. Here you see a picture of the Saudi Bedouin troops that they have, and they continue right up to the 20th century. And pilgrimage that you see on this picture continues, but it's no longer the dominant source of income. It's important here to realize that while the arrangement is, if we look at it now from the outside, or in hindsight particular, is highly skewed in favor of the foreign oil companies that explore for oil, because oil is a very valuable commodity and they pay only a pittance to the local rulers. But for the local rulers, this is an extremely advantageous arrangement because there's no local input required. They get free income, and that allows them to stabilize their rules. And at the same time, they get protection from in particular from Britain here. And this arrangement of free income and protection, that is the key that allows all of these societies to persist with their pre-modern social arrangements and allows them to basically avoid the challenges, the changes imposed by the modernizing process that we have talked so much about in the first week and also in the second week when we talked about Turkey. Here we have societies that are now protected from the rigors of modern competition, in the international state system, because they're protected and they get free income. And that is the pattern that comes to define these rentier economies that we will discuss at some length in the next video. You see here the oil industry develops dramatically from the 1930s onwards. Both the workers, the technology, the capital, the management, everything comes from the outside. It just takes place physically in these societies, but these societies are almost completely removed from the oil industry as such. And that is, again, a pattern that continues right up to contemporary times. So we see here a common pattern. You have countries or territories that have oil, that are protectorates of the British Empire. And now, particularly in the period after the Second World War, when decolonization sets in, there's the danger of popular unrest and also of other stronger neighboring states laying claims on these territories. So we see now that the formal colonial arrangements, the protectorates that had been put in place, they are no longer something that is deemed to be socially and politically acceptable. So we see the granting of formal independence by Britain to these areas, but the mutually advantageous financial arrangements, they continue, and we will explore them to some extent in one of the videos later this week when we talk about the rentier economies and what the particular arrangement is. But for you now to remember is that the territories now subsequently gain their formal independence. So Kuwait, that had been a British protectorate since 1899, becomes an independent state in 1961. Bahrain, which had been a treaty protectorate of Britain since 1820, becomes independent in 1971. Oman had never been a formal protectorate or a colony, but there are several treaties and they continue to exist, and the British presence in Oman continues right up to almost recent contemporary periods. In Saudi Arabia, as I said before, there's no formal protectorate or colonial arrangement, but there's a strong British presence and military presence and military protection. And as we will see later on, this role is eventually taken over by the United States after the Second World War. The United Arab Emirates, they had entered into a formal arrangement with Britain in 1853 as a trucial coast. So they had signed a perpetual truce with Britain to ensure maritime safety. And it's a de facto protectorate of Britain, and it becomes independent in the 1970s. Qatar, the same. It has been a British protectorate formally since 1916, and becomes independent in 1971. The particular dates are not so important for you to remember. The one thing that you should remember, however, is to get the overall picture. We have societies that are extremely traditional, whose way of life has not really changed much in several centuries, who had now been isolated from the competitive pressures of a modern international system, both first by their location and the geographical isolation, and now by the access of free oil wealth and an external protective power. And these societies now gain formal independence in a period that is in our own lifetime. So we're talking the last 40 to 50 years. And so state institutions and social institutions are now developing against the background of an extremely traditional society where these modern institutions did not exist. And they're now created in very, very young, very weak states, weak in terms of administrative capacity and institutionalization. And this contrasts with the enormous wealth that these rulers have at their disposal, and the expectations and the ambitions that are created by this wealth. And there is often, when external observers look at the region, there is a discrepancy where the claims and the ambitions being expressed are taken at face value and looked at the wealth that these societies now have at their disposal. And it's often forgotten how weak and how recent and how new these states actually are. And at the same time, one thing that is often forgotten is how weak the claim to legitimate authority of these rulers are. Remember, these are very traditional societies, and the chief claim of these rulers is to be the embodiment of a way of life and a way of governance that had been like this since time immemorial. But as we have now seen, there is nothing unchanging in these arrangements. Some of these, like Saudi Arabia, is actually a fairly new state and has consolidated itself fairly recently. And the chief claim to legitimacy is to be the protector of Islamic values in their societies. And particularly in the Saudi case, their legitimacy is tightly linked with the Wahhabi interpretation of Islam, which is very, very strict, very puritanical, almost xenophobic. And that contrasts with their extreme reliance on external protection. And the solution to this problem of legitimacy that the Saudis and the other Gulf states find is to propagate even more aggressively their own puritanical notion of Islam. And that's something we already discussed last week. It's one of the forms this attempt finds is the export of the mosque building program that Saudi Arabia in particular engages in, but also the granting of scholarships for Islamic studies in Saudi Arabia. And here we see the picture I've shown already last week of the King Faisal Mosque in Islamabad. So there is now an explicit attempt to bolster legitimacy through religion. And we will, in the next video, where we talk about the patrimonial system and its relationship to religion, we will explore this particular symbiosis a little bit further.